Since when do you date? That was the question that would change everything, though at the time I didn't know it yet. The first thing I noticed that night wasn't the music or the glittering chandeliers above the ballroom floor. It was the silence. A strange kind of silence that happens when powerful people suddenly stop talking at the same time. My hand tightened around the stem of my champagne glass as Daniel Hayes stepped beside me, his shoulder brushing mine while we walked into the Romano Foundation gala. The place looked like something out of a movie about people who owned entire city blocks. Marble floors polished so perfectly they reflected the golden light overhead. Men in tailored suits discussing numbers that probably had more zeros than my student loan balance. Women in dresses that cost more than the Honda Civic I drove to work every morning. I didn't belong there. Everyone knew it. Everyone except Daniel. Relax, he whispered beside me, smiling like this was just another networking event. Daniel was the kind of man who moved easily through rooms like this. 32 years old, venture capital, Harvard MBA, confident in a way that came from growing up around money. The exact opposite of me. Emily Carter, 27, executive assistant. The woman who organized Adrian Romano's entire empire one calendar appointment at a time. The woman who knew which governors called him privately, which CEOs owed him favors, and which meetings had to happen off the books. For 3 years, I had stood exactly 3 steps behind Adrian Romano in rooms just like this. Tonight was the first time I wasn't there because of him. Tonight, I came with someone else. And that was when the room changed. It didn't happen all at once. At first, it was just a ripple. A few heads turning. Conversations dropping half a sentence too early. Then the ripple became a wave moving slowly across the ballroom. People were looking past me. Not at Daniel. Past him. Toward the entrance behind us. I didn't need to turn around to know who had just arrived. You work for a man long enough. You learn to feel his presence before you see him. Adrian Romano never raised his voice. He never rushed. But when he walked into a room, the air shifted around him like gravity had just increased by 10 pounds. Daniel noticed it too. His smile faded slightly as he glanced over my shoulder. Is that him? He asked quietly. I turned. Adrian Romano stood near the entrance, tall and perfectly still beneath the soft glow of the chandeliers. 6'2", black suit cut so sharply it looked sculpted onto him. Dark hair brushed back from a face that belonged on the cover of business magazines. Around him moved the quiet rhythm of his security team, men who looked like they had stepped out of shadows and preferred staying there. But Adrian wasn't looking at them. He wasn't looking at the donors or the politicians lining up to greet him. His eyes were locked on me. More specifically, on Daniel standing beside me. For a moment, Adrian didn't move. The crystal glass in his hand hovered halfway to his lips, as if time had suddenly forgotten how to continue. I had seen Adrian Romano negotiate billion-dollar deals without blinking. I had watched senators wait outside his office like nervous interns. I had never seen him hesitate. Until that moment, Daniel extended a polite hand. I've heard a lot about you, he said, professional and calm. Adrian finally started walking toward us. The crowd parted without being asked. People always moved out of Adrian Romano's way. When he stopped in front of us, he didn't look at Daniel's hand. He didn't even acknowledge it. His eyes stayed on me. Cool. Focused. Unreadable. And then he asked the question in a voice so quiet that somehow everyone in the room still heard it. Since when do you date? Daniel slowly lowered his hand, the polite smile still on his face but tighter now, like he had just stepped into a conversation written in a language he did not fully understand. I felt the weight of every eye in the ballroom pressing against my back. Adrian Romano was still looking at me, not angry, not loud, just intensely focused in the quiet way that always made people nervous. I had seen billion-dollar executives stumble over their words under that stare. Tonight it was my turn. I forced myself to breathe and lifted my chin slightly. Since recently, I said. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. Daniel glanced at me briefly, surprised by the direct answer, but he did not interrupt. Adrian's gaze did not move away from my face. For a moment, I thought he might say something sharp, something that would turn this entire ballroom into a stage. Instead, he spoke slowly. Interesting. Just one word. But the way he said it carried a weight that made the air feel heavier around us. Daniel tried again, extending his hand once more with the calm persistence of someone used to negotiating uncomfortable moments. Daniel Hayes, he said. I invest in technology firms on the West Coast. Adrian finally shifted his eyes toward him. The movement was small but deliberate, like a chess player acknowledging a new piece on the board. He did not take the handshake. He simply studied Daniel for 2 quiet seconds that somehow felt much longer. Adrian Romano, he replied, though everyone within 50 feet already knew exactly who he was. Daniel lowered his hand again, this time for good, but he kept his composure. I respected that about him. Most people in this city tried too hard around Adrian. Daniel did not. The music in the ballroom resumed somewhere behind us, a soft string quartet that felt strangely distant. Conversations slowly restarted, though I could still sense people listening without looking directly at us. Adrian turned his attention back to me. "You did not mention this," he said. The sentence sounded simple, but I knew exactly what he meant. For 3 years I had managed his schedule, his travel, his meetings across 3 time zones. Adrian Romano knew where every hour of my workday went. What he did not know was what happened after 6 o'clock. Until tonight. I folded my arms lightly, not defensive, just steady. I did not think my personal life needed to be on the company calendar. For the first time that evening something flickered in Adrian's expression. Not anger. Something closer to surprise. Daniel cleared his throat gently. "Emily has mentioned she works incredibly hard for you," he said in a polite tone. I finally convinced her to take one night off. Adrian looked at him again, slower this time, as if weighing every word. "Did you?" It was not a question. It sounded more like a quiet observation filed away for later. The room around us continued moving. Waiters passing with silver trays, donors greeting each other near the stage, but the small circle around the 3 of us felt suspended outside the rest of the night. Adrian stepped slightly closer. Not enough to invade my space, but close enough that I could smell the faint scent of his cologne, clean and understated. "Emily Carter," he said quietly, still holding my gaze. "You never bring strangers into my world." Daniel's eyebrows lifted slightly. Stranger is a strong word. Adrian did not look at him this time. His eyes stayed on me. Calm, controlled, and unmistakably serious. It is the accurate one. I felt my pulse quicken despite my effort to stay composed. For 3 years Adrian Romano had kept a professional distance, so precise it could have been measured with a ruler. Tonight that distance had suddenly disappeared. I tilted my head slightly and met his stare without blinking. "Then maybe it is time you get used to it." For the first time since walking into the ballroom, Adrian Romano's composure cracked just enough for me to see it. Not anger, not irritation, something far more dangerous. Jealousy. I realized the moment the word left my mouth that something had shifted. Adrian Romano did not react the way most men would. He did not raise his voice. He did not step closer. Instead, he went very still, the kind of stillness that always made people around him uneasy because it meant he was thinking several moves ahead. The soft music continued somewhere across the ballroom, violins drifting through the air while waiters moved between tables carrying trays of champagne. The night was supposed to be elegant and effortless. Instead, it felt like the entire room was quietly waiting to see what Adrian Romano would do next. Daniel shifted beside me, not intimidated exactly, but aware that he had walked into a situation with a long history he did not fully understand. "Emily told me you 2 work together," he said calmly, his voice polite but steady. "She speaks very highly of your organization." Adrian's eyes moved to Daniel again, measured and thoughtful. "She does," he said. It sounded less like a response and more like a quiet note filed somewhere in his mind. Then his gaze returned to me. 3 years, he said. I knew exactly what he meant without needing more explanation. 3 years of early mornings, late nights, international flights, and boardrooms where decisions worth millions of dollars were made in minutes. 3 years of standing beside him while he built an empire piece by piece. 3 years, I confirmed. Adrian studied me for a moment that stretched longer than comfortable. The lights above the ballroom reflected faintly in his dark eyes, but there was something else there tonight. Something unfamiliar. Daniel glanced between us. I did not realize your professional partnership went that far back, he said. His tone remained friendly, but I could hear the curiosity underneath. Adrian finally turned slightly toward him. Emily Carter keeps my entire world organized, he said calmly. Without her, half the companies represented in this room would miss their meetings. Daniel smiled politely. That sounds like someone very difficult to replace. Adrian did not smile back. She is. The answer came quickly. Too quickly. The silence that followed was subtle but noticeable. I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to tighten. Daniel tried to ease the moment by lifting his glass slightly. "Well, then I should probably thank you," he said lightly. "If Emily did not work such long hours, she might never have agreed to dinner with me." That was when Adrian Romano blinked. Just once. Anyone else in the room might have missed it. I did not. In 3 years I had learned every detail of his expressions, the small shifts most people overlooked. That single blink meant the words had landed exactly where Daniel intended. Adrian looked at me again, his voice quieter now. "Dinner." It was not really a question, but I answered anyway. "Yes." His jaw tightened slightly, almost imperceptibly. The orchestra swelled gently behind us as couples moved toward the dance floor, the rest of the gala continuing as if this conversation did not exist. Adrian slipped one hand into the pocket of his suit jacket, the motion smooth and controlled. "And you chose tonight to introduce him to my world." I felt my pulse quicken but forced myself to stay steady. "I chose tonight to have a normal evening." Adrian repeated the word softly, almost thoughtfully. "Normal." For a brief second the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, more like a private thought passing through his mind. Then his gaze lifted again to Daniel. "Tell me something, Mr. Hayes," he said calmly. Daniel straightened slightly. "Of course." Adrian's voice remained perfectly even, but there was a quiet intensity beneath it now that made the air around us feel different. "When you asked Emily Carter to dinner," he said slowly, "did you know exactly whose world you were stepping into?" Daniel did not answer immediately. For the first time since walking into the ballroom, he seemed to consider the question carefully, as if weighing how honest he wanted to be in front of a man whose reputation filled entire columns of financial news. The quiet music continued drifting through the room, while the glow of crystal chandeliers reflected across the marble floor. Around us the gala carried on politely, but the invisible circle surrounding the three of us felt smaller with every passing second. Daniel finally spoke in a calm voice. "I knew Emily worked for someone powerful," he said. That part was not exactly a secret. Adrian listened without interrupting. His expression remained perfectly controlled, but I could see the small tension along his jawline again. Daniel continued, "But I did not realize that meant I needed permission to ask her to dinner." The answer was respectful, yet direct enough to land exactly where it needed to. Adrian's gaze did not change, but something thoughtful passed through his eyes, as if he had just updated his opinion of the man standing in front of him. "You do not need permission," Adrian said after a moment. His tone remained calm, measured, almost diplomatic. "But understanding the environment you step into can be useful." Daniel nodded slightly. "That sounds like advice." "It is." The two men held each other's attention for a few seconds, not hostile, but unmistakably evaluating one another. I suddenly realized that for the first time since we arrived, Adrian had not looked away from Daniel voluntarily. It was the same look he used in negotiations, the quiet concentration that meant he was studying every detail. Finally, Daniel glanced toward me and gave a small smile. "Emily already warned me you run a very serious organization." Adrian's eyes shifted back to me again, and the moment the attention returned, I felt my heartbeat quicken slightly. "Did she?" Adrian said quietly. "Yes," Daniel replied before I could speak. "She also mentioned you expect absolute loyalty from the people who work with you." Adrian's expression remained unreadable. "That expectation has worked well so far." I folded my arms lightly, trying to keep the conversation balanced. "Daniel asked me to come tonight because he thought I deserved a break from work." Adrian looked at me with that same calm focus. "And do you?" It sounded like a simple question, but the way he said it carried something deeper beneath the surface. I held his gaze. "Sometimes." Adrian considered that for a moment. Then his eyes moved briefly toward Daniel again. "Mr. Hayes," he said slowly, "how long have you known Emily Carter?" Daniel answered honestly. "About 2 months." Adrian nodded once. 2 months. His voice remained neutral, but I could hear the quiet calculation in the repetition. Then he looked at me again. "And in 2 months he has convinced you to bring him here." I felt the faintest hint of frustration rise in my chest. "I brought him here because this is a charity event, Adrian, not a board meeting." For a brief second something unexpected appeared in his expression. Not anger. Something closer to reluctant amusement. The corner of his mouth shifted slightly before returning to its usual composure. "You are right," he said calmly. This is not a board meeting. He stepped back half a pace, creating just enough distance to ease the pressure in the air around us. Then he looked at Daniel once more. Enjoy the evening, Mr. Hayes. Daniel inclined his head politely. Thank you. Adrian's attention returned to me one last time before he turned away. Emily, he said quietly. Just my name. Nothing more. Yet the way he said it carried the same authority he used when giving instructions that moved entire companies. Then Adrian Romano walked away through the crowd, people instinctively stepping aside as he passed. Daniel watched him disappear toward the far side of the ballroom before exhaling slowly. That, he said softly beside me, was not exactly the introduction I expected. I kept watching the direction Adrian had gone, because even though he had walked away, I could feel one thing with absolute certainty. This conversation was not finished. For several seconds, I kept looking at the space where Adrian Romano had disappeared into the crowd, even though the ballroom had already swallowed him again. The music felt louder now, the soft violin melody floating above conversations and quiet laughter as if nothing unusual had just happened. Daniel shifted beside me and gently tapped the side of his glass against mine. Well, he said with a half-amused breath, that was impressive. I turned toward him slightly. Impressive. Your boss, he clarified. Most people try to dominate a room by talking louder than everyone else. He does it by barely speaking at all. I could not argue with that. In 3 years, I had watched Adrian Romano silence entire boardrooms with nothing more than a pause at the right moment. Daniel studied my face for a second. You did not warn me he would react like that. I looked down briefly at the champagne in my hand before answering. I did not expect him to. That was the honest truth. Adrian had always maintained a precise professional distance with me. Meetings, flights, strategy sessions, late nights reviewing contracts. But never once had he crossed the invisible line between employer and employee. Not even close. Daniel leaned lightly against one of the tall cocktail tables nearby. You realize he was not asking casual questions. I gave a quiet smile. Adrian does not ask casual questions. Daniel laughed softly. That much I figured out. Around us the gala continued with polished elegance. A group of donors near the stage applauded politely as someone began a short speech about the Foundation's education programs. Waiters moved through the crowd offering small plates and refilling glasses. It looked like any other charity event in Manhattan. Except my attention kept drifting toward the far side of the ballroom. You are still watching for him, Daniel observed gently. I blinked and forced myself to look back at him. Habit, I said. 3 years of managing his schedule will do that to a person. Daniel nodded slowly. It looked like more than habit. The comment hung between us for a moment. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, a familiar voice spoke quietly behind me. Miss Carter. I turned. One of Adrian's security coordinators stood there, tall and composed in a dark suit. His name was Victor. I recognized him immediately because he had been working with Adrian's team for years. Victor gave Daniel a polite nod before focusing on me. Mr. Romano would like a word with you when you have a moment. Daniel raised his eyebrows slightly. Of course he would. Victor remained perfectly neutral. No urgency. Mr. Romano simply asked that I pass along the message. I looked past Victor toward the upper balcony that overlooked the ballroom. Adrian Romano stood there alone near the railing, one hand resting casually in his pocket as he looked down at the crowd below. Even from across the room, I could feel the focus of his attention. He was watching us. Daniel followed my gaze and let out a quiet breath. I have a feeling declining that invitation is not really an option. I exhaled slowly. Not usually. Daniel set his empty glass down on the table and offered a reassuring smile. Go talk to him. I hesitated for a second. You do not mind. Emily, he said gently. If I am going to understand the world you work in, I should probably start by letting you handle your boss. I gave a small nod. Victor stepped aside as I began walking across the ballroom floor, the polished marble reflecting every step. Conversations continued around me, but the closer I got to the staircase leading up to the balcony, the quieter everything seemed to feel. When I reached the top step, Adrian Romano turned slightly, already aware that I was there before I said a word. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who had been waiting for exactly this conversation. Adrian Romano did not speak immediately when I stepped onto the balcony. The city lights stretched beyond the glass walls of the ballroom, Manhattan glowing beneath the late evening sky like a grid of quiet fire. From up here, the music sounded softer, almost distant, and the murmur of the crowd below blended into a steady background hum. Adrian rested one hand on the railing, his posture relaxed but deliberate, as if every movement had already been considered. For a moment, he simply watched the room below. Then he said quietly, "You brought him here." It was not a question. I stopped a few feet away from him, giving him the same professional distance we had always maintained. "It is a charity gala," I replied. "Guests are allowed." Adrian turned his head slightly, his eyes settling on me with that calm focus I knew too well. "You have attended many events with me before." "As your assistant," I corrected gently. "Tonight, I came as myself." That answer seemed to linger in the air between us. Adrian studied my expression for a long second, as if searching for something deeper beneath the words. "Daniel Hayes," he said after a moment. "Venture capital, San Francisco office, 2 technology funds, and a recent acquisition in Austin." I blinked once, not entirely surprised. Adrian Romano. Rarely met someone without already knowing their background. "You researched him?" I said. "I research everyone who appears in my orbit." His voice remained even, but the meaning behind it was unmistakable. I crossed my arms lightly. "He is not a threat." Adrian looked back toward the ballroom floor below us, where Daniel was now speaking with a group of donors near one of the tall cocktail tables. "That remains to be seen." His tone was not hostile, just analytical, like he was evaluating a potential business partner rather than the man who had taken me to dinner. I exhaled slowly. "Adrian, this is not a negotiation." He glanced at me again, one eyebrow lifting slightly. "No." Then he turned fully toward me, the balcony lights catching the sharp lines of his face. "It is not." The silence that followed felt heavier than the music drifting up from the ballroom. I had worked beside this man for 3 years, seen him manage crises that would have overwhelmed most executives. Yet tonight, there was something different in the way he watched me. Something more personal. "You did not mention him," Adrian said finally. "I did not think I needed to." "You did not." His response came quickly, but he did not look away. "However, I find it interesting that the first time you introduce him to my environment is at an event filled with investors, politicians, and half the companies on the East Coast." I tilted my head slightly. "You make it sound like I staged a strategy meeting." Adrian's mouth moved almost into a smile before settling again. "Did you not?" I felt a flicker of frustration, but kept my voice calm. "I accepted a dinner invitation 2 months ago. Tonight was simply the first time our schedules aligned with an evening like this." Adrian studied me again, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he was piecing together a puzzle that did not fit the usual patterns. 2 months, he repeated. "You have been seeing him for 2 months, and you chose not to mention it." I met his gaze without hesitation. "You have never asked about my personal life." For the first time, Adrian looked momentarily caught off guard by the answer. The reaction was subtle, but I knew him well enough to recognize it. He rested both hands on the railing now, looking out across the skyline again. "That was intentional," he said quietly. I stepped closer, just enough that the city lights reflected faintly between us and the glass. "Why?" Adrian Romano remained silent for a few seconds, watching the endless stream of headlights far below on Fifth Avenue. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a note I had never heard from him before. "Because I thought it was safer that way." The word lingered in the air longer than I expected. Safer. I watched Adrian Romano carefully, trying to understand what he meant, because in 3 years he had never once spoken to me in a tone like that. Below us, the ballroom continued to glow with polished elegance, the quiet orchestra drifting through the air while people laughed and raised glasses to charity and opportunity. But up here on the balcony, the world felt separated from all of it. "Safer for who?" I asked quietly. Adrian did not answer immediately. His eyes stayed on the city lights stretching across Manhattan, endless windows glowing in tall buildings that touched the night sky. Cars moved slowly along Fifth Avenue like ribbons of light. Finally he spoke. "For you." The answer surprised me more than I expected. I let out a small breath. "Adrian, I manage your entire schedule. I know every meeting you attend and half the decisions you make. I have been around this world for years." He nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth in that statement. "Yes," he said, "you have." Then he turned his head and looked directly at me again. "But you have always been beside it, not inside it." I frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" Adrian considered the question as if choosing his words carefully, something he rarely needed to do. People in my position do not have normal lives, he said calmly. Every relationship becomes a negotiation. Every introduction has consequences. His voice remained steady, but the meaning beneath it carried more weight than anything he had said earlier that night. I leaned against the railing, facing him fully now. Daniel is not part of your business world. Adrian's eyes moved briefly toward the ballroom floor again, where Daniel was still speaking with donors. Not yet. The two words landed heavier than they should have. I shook my head slightly. You are reading too much into a dinner invitation. Adrian watched me for a moment before replying. You believe that? It was not sarcasm. It was simply a statement of fact. The wind from the open balcony doors stirred slightly, carrying the faint sound of laughter from inside the ballroom. I crossed my arms again, trying to steady the strange tension that had been building between us since the moment Adrian saw Daniel beside me. You have never had an opinion about who I spend time with before, I said. Adrian's gaze did not move. That is not entirely true. I blinked. Then why did you never say anything? Adrian Romano was quiet again, and the silence felt heavier than before. In the distance, a helicopter moved slowly across the skyline, its lights blinking red against the dark sky. When Adrian finally spoke, his voice was softer than usual. Because saying something would have changed things. The answer settled in my chest like a puzzle piece that did not quite fit yet. I studied his expression, searching for the same calm certainty he always carried into every room. But tonight there was something else there. Something restrained. Changed what? I asked quietly. Adrian did not answer immediately. His eyes moved past me toward the ballroom doors for a moment, as if confirming that no one else had followed me up here. Then he looked back at me with a seriousness that made my heartbeat quicken slightly. The distance between us, he said. The words hung in the air like a line neither of us had crossed before. I felt my pulse pick up despite my effort to remain composed. We work together, I said carefully. Adrian nodded once. Yes. Then his gaze lowered slightly, just long enough to notice the subtle detail that had started this entire conversation tonight. The way Daniel Hayes had stood beside me downstairs. The way his hand had rested lightly at the small of my back when we walked into the room. Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before his eyes returned to mine. And tonight, he said quietly, for the first time in 3 years, I realized I do not like seeing someone else stand where I always have. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. The sentence Adrian Romano had just spoken did not sound like something a man like him would ever admit out loud. For 3 years, he had been the most controlled person I had ever known. Every meeting, every negotiation, every decision calculated with precision. Yet now he stood only a few feet away from me on the balcony overlooking Manhattan, and the words between us felt dangerously personal. Adrian, I said quietly, that is not the same thing. He watched me without interrupting, waiting for me to finish. You standing beside me at work is not the same as someone asking me to dinner. His expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened slightly, as if he was studying every part of my response. You are right, he said calmly. It is not the same. The wind moved gently through the open balcony doors again, carrying the distant sound of music and conversation from inside the ballroom. Somewhere below us, people applauded as the speaker finished another short speech about the Foundation's programs. But up here, the air between us remained still and tense. Adrian rested one hand against the railing again, his posture composed but thoughtful. When you walked into that room tonight, he said slowly, you were not standing behind me like you always do. I felt a small flash of frustration. That is because I was not there as your assistant. Exactly. His response came immediately. I crossed my arms lightly. Adrian, you cannot expect me to spend my entire life orbiting your schedule. Adrian's eyes lifted back to mine, and the calm intensity in them made the words hang in the air longer than I expected. I never expected that. Then why does it sound like you do not want anyone else near me? For the first time since the conversation began, Adrian looked slightly unsettled by the directness of the question. The reaction was subtle, but I noticed it immediately because I had spent years watching for the smallest shift in his expression. He exhaled slowly and glanced back out toward the skyline again. The city stretched endlessly in front of us, bright windows and quiet rooftops glowing beneath the night sky. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. Because tonight was the first time I realized something I should have recognized a long time ago. I waited, my pulse quickening slightly without my permission. Adrian turned back toward me, and the seriousness in his gaze made the distance between us feel suddenly much smaller. "Emily Carter," he said, speaking my name with the same careful tone he used when making decisions that affected entire companies. "You have been the most constant person in my world for 3 years." I did not know how to answer that. The statement was true, but hearing it from him felt different. Adrian continued before I could speak. "You organize everything. You anticipate problems before they happen. You know how I think before I say a word." His eyes held mine steadily. And until tonight, I never stopped to ask myself what would happen if someone else became the most important person in your life. The quiet honesty in his voice made my chest tighten. I looked away briefly toward the ballroom doors, trying to steady the sudden rush of emotions I had not expected to face tonight. "That is not something you get to control," I said softly. Adrian did not argue. He simply nodded once. "No," he agreed. Then he took a slow breath and looked back at the ballroom floor below, where Daniel Hayes still stood talking with donors, completely unaware of the conversation happening above him. Adrian's gaze remained there for several seconds before returning to me again. When he spoke this time, the calm certainty had returned to his voice, but the meaning behind the words was unmistakable. "But it is something I cannot ignore anymore." The words settled between us like a quiet storm that had not decided whether it would pass or grow stronger. I looked at Adrian Romano and realized something that had never crossed my mind during the past 3 years. For the first time since I had started working for him, he did not look like the man who always knew exactly what came next. He looked like someone standing at the edge of a decision he had avoided for a very long time. "Ignoring something does not mean you get to change it," I said carefully. Adrian's gaze remained steady. "I am aware of that." The calmness in his voice was back, but now I could hear something else beneath it. Determination. I shifted slightly against the railing, the cool metal pressing against my palms as I glanced toward the ballroom again. Daniel Hayes was still down there, speaking with 2 investors near the stage. He looked relaxed, confident, completely unaware of the quiet storm unfolding above him. I turned back to Adrian. "Then what exactly are you saying?" Adrian did not answer right away. His eyes followed my earlier glance toward the ballroom floor before returning to me. The silence stretched for several seconds. Then he spoke. "I am saying that tonight changed something." My heartbeat quickened slightly, though I tried not to show it. "For you?" Adrian nodded once. "Yes." I studied him carefully, searching for the careful business logic he usually applied to everything. But this conversation did not feel like a negotiation. It felt personal in a way I had never experienced with him before. "You have always kept a distance," I reminded him. "You made that choice." "I did. And now suddenly that distance bothers you." Adrian rested both hands against the railing, leaning slightly forward as he looked out across the glowing skyline again. "It does." I shook my head slightly, half confused, half frustrated. "Adrian, people do not get to rewrite 3 years of professional boundaries in one evening." His attention shifted back to me instantly. "I am not rewriting anything." The calm certainty in his tone made me pause. "Then what are you doing?" Adrian Romano studied me for a long moment, the same way he studied complicated deals that required absolute precision. When he finally answered, his voice was quiet but unmistakably clear. "I am recognizing a mistake." The statement caught me off guard. In all the time I had known him, Adrian rarely described anything in his life as a mistake. He simply adjusted strategy and moved forward. "What mistake?" I asked softly. Adrian's eyes did not leave mine. Assuming that keeping distance would make things easier. My pulse quickened again, and I felt the strange awareness of how close we were standing on the balcony now. Not physically close, but the conversation itself had closed a distance that had existed for years. "Easier for who?" I asked again. Adrian gave a faint breath that almost sounded like a quiet laugh, though there was no amusement in it. "For both of us." I searched his expression, trying to understand the weight behind that answer. Below us, the orchestra shifted into another slow melody, couples beginning to move across the dance floor. The gala continued with perfect elegance. But the world above the balcony felt entirely different. "You still have not told me what you want," I said finally. Adrian looked down toward the ballroom again, his gaze settling briefly on Daniel Hayes before returning to me. When he spoke again, his voice carried the same calm authority he used when making decisions that shaped entire industries. But this time the decision sounded personal. I want to know if you brought Daniel Hayes here tonight because you are curious about him, he said slowly, or because you are ready to walk away from the space you have always held in my life. The question settled in the quiet space between us like a line drawn across the floor that neither of us had crossed before. I felt my breath pause for a moment as I looked at Adrian Romano, because for the first time in 3 years he was not asking about schedules or contracts or travel plans. He was asking about me. The orchestra below shifted into another soft melody while the ballroom lights reflected across the marble floor. People were beginning to move toward the dance floor, laughing and speaking with the easy confidence of a room filled with powerful people who believed they controlled their own futures. But up here on the balcony, I suddenly felt like the entire night had narrowed down to a single answer. I glanced toward the ballroom again, where Daniel Hayes stood near the stage, now listening politely to a group of investors discussing a new development project in Miami. He looked exactly the same as he had when we arrived. Calm, confident, completely normal. Then I looked back at Adrian. That is not a fair question, I said quietly. Adrian's expression did not change, but his eyes remained fixed on mine. It is an honest one. I shook my head slightly. You are asking me to explain something that you only started questioning 10 minutes ago. Adrian accepted that without argument. That is true. The calmness in his voice made the conversation feel even heavier. I folded my arms loosely, trying to steady the mixture of emotions building in my chest. Daniel asked me to dinner 2 months ago, I said. He is intelligent. He respects my time. He does not expect me to organize the rest of the world before I organize my own life. Adrian listened without interrupting. The city lights reflected faintly in his dark eyes as he studied my expression. And you enjoy spending time with him. I hesitated for a moment before answering honestly. Yes. Adrian nodded once. The reaction was so controlled that someone who did not know him well might have missed the small shift in his posture. But I noticed it immediately. 3 years had taught me how to read the smallest signals. And yet you brought him here tonight, Adrian said slowly, into a room where he does not belong. I frowned slightly. Daniel belongs anywhere he chooses to stand. Adrian's gaze sharpened, but there was no anger in it. Only quiet focus. You misunderstood me, he said calmly. I did not mean that he lacks the ability to be here. I waited. Adrian looked briefly toward the ballroom again before returning his attention to me. I meant that he does not belong in the part of your life that exists around me. The statement caught me off guard. I searched his face, trying to understand the exact meaning behind those words. You keep drawing a line between those two worlds, I said softly. Adrian nodded once. Because there is one. The certainty in his voice was unmistakable. I exhaled slowly and looked back toward the ballroom doors where the warm light spilled out onto the balcony floor. You asked me a question, I said. Whether I brought Daniel here because I am curious about him, or because I am ready to walk away from the space I hold in your life. Adrian did not move. He waited. I met his gaze again, holding it steadily. The truth is, I continued quietly. Until tonight, I never realized those two things might be connected. Adrian Romano did not respond immediately. The silence stretched for several seconds while the music below drifted upward and the city lights continued to glow beyond the glass walls. Finally he spoke, his voice low and steady. And now that you do. I held his gaze, feeling the weight of everything that had remained unspoken between us for 3 years. Now, I said softly, I think you should tell me why it matters so much to you. Adrian Romano did not answer right away. The question seemed to settle over the balcony like a quiet weight that neither of us could ignore anymore. For a long moment, he simply watched me, the city lights reflecting faintly in his eyes while the music from the ballroom drifted softly through the open doors behind us. I had seen that look before during difficult negotiations, the one that meant he was choosing his words carefully because the outcome mattered more than usual. But this time the negotiation was not about business. Finally Adrian spoke. Because you are not just another person in my life, Emily. The calm certainty in his voice made my chest tighten slightly. I studied his expression, searching for the composed distance he normally kept between us. It was still there, but thinner now, like a wall that had started to crack. You say that like it should be obvious, I replied quietly. Adrian gave a small breath that almost sounded like a restrained laugh. For 3 years I made sure it was not. The honesty of the admission surprised me. Adrian Romano rarely admitted to anything that sounded like regret. I rested my hands lightly against the balcony railing, the cool metal grounding me while I tried to understand where this conversation was going. Then explain it, I said softly. Adrian looked down toward the ballroom again, where Daniel Hayes now stood near the dance floor speaking with a woman in a silver dress. Daniel looked comfortable there, moving easily through the room in a way that belonged to people who had built their lives in that world. Adrian watched him for a few seconds before returning his attention to me. You asked why it matters, he said. It matters because you are the only person in my life who has never wanted anything from me. The statement caught me off guard. I blinked, surprised by the seriousness in his voice. Adrian continued before I could respond. Everyone else in that room wants something, he said calmly. Investments, influence, access, partnerships. His eyes moved slowly across the ballroom below us. Some of them want my money. Some of them want my connections. Some of them want the protection that comes with my name. Then his gaze returned to me again. You never did. I felt a small knot form in my chest as I listened. Adrian's voice remained quiet but steady. When you started working for me 3 years ago, you treated my world like it was simply another job to organize. Flights, meetings, contracts, problems to solve. His eyes held mine steadily. You never looked at me the way the rest of that room does. I let out a slow breath, unsure how to respond to something that personal. Adrian rested one hand against the railing again. That is why I kept the distance, he said. Because the moment that distance disappeared, the one thing in my life that felt honest might disappear with it. The quiet sincerity in his words made the air between us feel different again. I looked toward the ballroom, where Daniel stood laughing at something one of the investors had said. Then I looked back at Adrian. You are assuming that would happen, I said gently. Adrian shook his head slightly. I was protecting something that worked. I studied him for a moment, feeling the weight of everything he had just admitted. And now you think that protection was a mistake. Adrian met my gaze without hesitation. Yes. The single word hung between us, steady and undeniable. I crossed my arms lightly, considering everything he had said. Adrian, I said slowly, you are talking about changing something that has defined our entire relationship for 3 years. Adrian did not look away. The calm determination in his eyes had returned, but now it carried something deeper beneath it. I know. The music below shifted again as couples began moving across the dance floor under the golden lights of the ballroom. Adrian glanced toward them briefly before looking back at me. When he spoke again, his voice was lower than before, but far more certain. But watching someone else stand beside you tonight made me realize something else. I waited, my heartbeat picking up again despite my effort to stay calm. Adrian Romano held my gaze and finished the sentence with quiet clarity. I do not want to spend the next 3 years pretending that distance is the only place I belong in your life. I did not answer immediately. Adrian's last sentence still echoed in the quiet space between us, heavier than anything that had been said tonight. For 3 years our entire relationship had existed within carefully drawn lines. Employer and assistant. Strategy and execution. Precision and distance. And now he was standing in front of me telling me he did not want those lines anymore. I turned slightly toward the balcony railing, looking out at the city lights stretching across Manhattan while I tried to slow the sudden rush of thoughts moving through my mind. Below us the orchestra continued playing, and the dance floor had begun to fill with couples moving slowly beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers. The gala looked exactly the same as it had when the night began, but nothing about this moment felt the same. Adrian, I said quietly after a long pause, do you realize what you are saying? He did not hesitate. Yes. I turned back toward him, studying his expression carefully. The calm confidence that defined him had returned, but it felt different now. Less distant. More personal. For 3 years, I continued slowly. You built a very clear structure between us. Work. Professional boundaries. Predictable rules. Adrian nodded once. I know. And tonight you want to erase all of that. Adrian shook his head slightly. Not erase it. His eyes held mine steadily. Change it. The difference between those 2 words felt enormous. I crossed my arms loosely, trying to steady the mixture of confusion and awareness building inside my chest. You are asking me to believe that one moment downstairs changed how you see everything. Adrian took a slow breath and glanced toward the ballroom again, where Daniel Hayes had now stepped onto the edge of the dance floor with one of the donors. Daniel looked comfortable there, smiling easily while the music carried across the room. Adrian watched for a moment before looking back at me. "No," he said calmly. "Tonight did not change everything." I waited. Adrian stepped slightly closer to the railing beside me, close enough that our shoulders were only a few inches apart. Tonight only forced me to admit something that has been building for a long time. The quiet certainty in his voice made my pulse quicken again. I turned fully toward him. "Why now?" Adrian met my gaze without hesitation. "Because tonight I saw what happens if I keep pretending that distance is enough." His eyes moved briefly toward the ballroom again. "Someone else eventually steps into the space you leave empty." The honesty in that sentence settled deep in my chest. I looked down toward the dance floor where Daniel was now laughing softly at something his partner had said while they moved slowly with the music. For 2 months, Daniel Hayes had represented something simple. A normal dinner. Easy conversation. A life that did not revolve around corporate negotiations and private flights and schedules that crossed 3 time zones. But now standing here with Adrian Romano, I realized that nothing about my life had ever truly been simple. I turned back toward him. "You waited 3 years to say any of this." Adrian nodded slightly. "Yes." "Why?" Adrian did not look away. "Because saying it means I am no longer neutral." The statement carried the same quiet authority he used when making irreversible decisions in business. I searched his expression, realizing the weight behind what he had just admitted. "And you are comfortable with that risk?" Adrian's answer came without hesitation. "With you," he said quietly. "It is no longer a risk I want to avoid." The words lingered between us while the music below shifted into a slower melody. For the first time since the night began, I felt something change inside me as well. Not certainty, but awareness. I looked toward the ballroom once more, then back at Adrian Romano standing beside me beneath the soft balcony lights. "Then you should understand something too," I said quietly. Adrian waited. I held his gaze steadily before finishing the thought. "If the distance disappears now, nothing between us will ever go back to the way it was before." I held Adrian Romano's gaze after the words left my mouth, aware that the quiet truth between us had finally reached a point where neither of us could pretend it was only about work anymore. The city lights stretched endlessly behind him, while the warm glow of the ballroom spilled across the balcony floor, soft music drifting upward through the open doors. For a long moment Adrian did not speak. He simply watched me with the same focused calm he used when deciding the future of entire companies. Then he nodded once. "I know," he said quietly. There was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty, just the same steady confidence that had built his empire from nothing. I studied his expression, trying to find even a small sign that he might reconsider what he had just admitted tonight. But Adrian Romano did not look like a man who stepped backward once he understood something clearly. "You were certain about that?" I said softly. Adrian gave a faint breath that almost sounded like a quiet laugh. "Emily," he replied calmly. "Certainty is the only reason I ever say anything out loud." The honesty of that answer made something inside my chest tighten again. For 3 years I had watched this man calculate every risk with surgical precision. Yet, tonight he had stepped into unfamiliar territory without any hesitation at all. I looked toward the ballroom again where Daniel Hayes had just finished his conversation and now stood near the edge of the dance floor, scanning the room as if he was wondering where I had gone. The orchestra continued its slow melody while couples moved beneath the golden lights of the chandeliers. It looked like the perfect charity gala from the outside. But for me, the entire night had turned into something much more complicated. I turned back toward Adrian. "Daniel is expecting me to come back downstairs," I said quietly. Adrian followed my glance briefly before looking at me again. His expression remained composed, but there was no mistaking the awareness in his eyes now. "Yes," he said. I waited, unsure what he would say next. Adrian rested his hands lightly against the balcony railing and looked out across the skyline once more. The endless lights of Manhattan reflected faintly in the glass walls beside us. When he finally spoke again, his voice was calm, but unmistakably deliberate. "You should go back to him." The answer surprised me slightly. I tilted my head, studying his face. "That is not what I expected you to say." Adrian's mouth moved into the faintest hint of a smile. "It is the only honest thing I can say tonight." I waited while he continued. Adrian turned toward me again, the quiet intensity returning to his gaze. You deserve the chance to decide what you want without pressure from me. His voice remained steady. If Daniel Hayes represents the life you want outside of this world, then you should explore that possibility. The fairness of the statement made my chest tighten in a way I had not expected. I searched his expression carefully. And if I decide that is not what I want? Adrian's eyes held mine without hesitation. Then you come back upstairs, and we start a very different conversation. The simplicity of his answer made my heartbeat quicken again. For several seconds, neither of us moved. The music below shifted into another slow rhythm, while the city lights continued to glow endlessly beyond the balcony. I looked toward the ballroom doors, then back at Adrian Romano standing beside me under the soft lights of the balcony. For 3 years, he had been the most controlled and distant person in my world. Tonight, he had changed that completely with nothing more than a few honest sentences. I exhaled slowly and stepped toward the doorway leading back into the ballroom. Just before I crossed the threshold, I paused and looked back at him one last time. Adrian had not moved from the railing. He was still watching the city with the calm focus of a man who had already accepted whatever decision came next. I held his gaze for a moment longer before speaking quietly. Adrian, I said. He looked at me. I allowed a small smile to appear before finishing the thought. You might want to stay right here. Adrian's eyebrow lifted slightly. Why? I turned toward the ballroom again, already stepping inside. Because I do not plan to take very long.